This talk is my first one online, so I hope that it will go well. And I'm really looking forward to take on this challenge, but excuse me if I have some hiccups on the way. Next one. As you can see on your screen now, this book, The Boxer Rebellion by Diana Preston, is a very interesting book when it comes to the Boxer Rebellion. And when Melinda Liu from the Royal Asiatic Society contacted me and asked whether I would like to do a Zoom talk for the Royal Asiatic Society, I was actually just reading or rereading this book, because we are using this book in what we call the Beijing Postcards book club. And the interesting thing I think about this book when it comes to the Boxer Rebellion is that it is predominantly using Western sources. And if you don't know what the Boxer Rebellion was, then you should imagine that actually for 55 days in Beijing, the whole diplomatic society was kept under siege by the Chinese government and these boxers, and I will get back to who they were. And you literally tried to simply kill off all of the foreigners in China. The reason that I think it's interesting that the main sources for these books, for this book, is Western sources, is that when you read it, it's almost like being trapped inside sort of the Western mindset. And I think that a lot of us who lives here in China or other places in Asia, sometimes we feel that it is very difficult to get out of the box, out of this Western software that has been implemented in our brains. So it is almost, there's a whole lot of things in this book that I think relates directly to today, and not least to the ongoing coronavirus in China and now also the world. Next. But obviously, the Boxer Rebellion is not the coronavirus. Next. But, next, a crisis is a crisis. So when I thought about how could I structure this talk, then I thought that it was actually interesting to make an almost one-to-one comparison between the Boxer Rebellion and the coronavirus, because there are a lot of things that will always be present when you have sort of a crisis, and especially a crisis of sort of international dimensions. And the first thing that I would like us to look at next is that very often when you have these big sort of crises in the world, then they happen and they become a crisis because you have an old system, as an old system in decay. Next. And when it comes to the Chinese system in the year 1900, when the Boxer Rebellion took place, then the Chinese system had actually been in sort of decay for a while. And what you're looking at in your screens right now is a caricature of a lord who was called McCartney that visited China in 1793. And he came because his government was frustrated. His government wanted to open up China for commerce, because you had the problem in Europe that there was a huge market for things Chinese in Europe, but the Chinese didn't really want anything in return. I'm sure that you're all aware of the amounts of porcelain and silk and spices that floated into China at this point. And I think if you look at the caricature, you can also see how there is a hot air balloon and how the Westerners in the picture are holding all kinds of things up. And that's because this was pretty much a sales show. They were in China to try to negotiate with the Chinese, but they had a big problem. And that was that they did not know where to maneuver inside of the Chinese system. At this point, China did not even have what we could call a foreign ministry. So this was obviously a problem for the Europeans. And ultimately, because the emperor that you can see sitting there, fat and smoking, would simply pretty much ignore the Europeans. And the Qianlong, as the emperor was called at this point, would write a letter to the British Crown where he stated that China needed nothing from Europe. And this obviously did not ease tension. And next, it led to war. And the first of these wars was what we know today as the Opium War. Because the Europeans, not least the British, would by time find a product that you could sell in China from, and you would smuggle it in from around the harbor, where you had the only harbor where you on a seasonal basis could trade with the Chinese. And that was around Guangzhou, and you would smuggle in opium. So you would actually actively participate in making millions of Chinese into drug addicts. All of this ended with the Chinese government making opium smoking completely illegal, going down to Guangzhou and take tons of opium from the British tradesmen and destroy it. But when they did this, a trick had been pulled on them. And that was that this opium had actually been given to the British authorities. So you were actually now in direct conflict with the British Crown. And this ended in war, the First Opium War. And from then on, around 1840, you can think of it as a door to China that was simply smashed in, and more wars would follow. And the central government would lose more and more and more of its power. And the Europeans would force, and the Westerners would force their own systems upon China. And after the Second Opium War, 20 years later, then for the first time, you would actually have what we would call embassies today in Beijing. And they were forced upon the capital when around 1860, you started to have the first legation quarter in China. The areas that the Europeans would open with force, and that they would, and by treaty, they would have a special access to these areas, like Shanghai and Tianjin and Hong Kong, of course, they would start to develop extremely fast. But they would also wear away of the central power. So Beijing would become a fairly backwards place, you could say. So when it comes to having a system in decay, the central government of China definitely qualifies. But we should also not forget that when we're talking about the year 1900, the whole world order was also actually a little bit in decay, because new powers had emerged, like Germany, like Japan, and the whole sort of colonial enterprise of the world was actually also in trouble. Another power that we should not ignore that also had emerged was obviously also the US. Next. Another thing that you also need to create a crisis, often at least, is a surprising turn of events. And if we look at the corona crisis, obviously that's not difficult to find. I think that none of us has ever sort of believed that we would be in the situation worldwide that we are in now. But the tipping point, the thing that really made the Boxer Rebellion into an enormous crisis worldwide was this guy, Clemens von Ketteler. Because the Boxer Rebellion started with some people that were sort of standing up against the foreigners in the countryside. You had a big drought that made a lot of peasants not able to attend to their fields. You had people starving, but you also had people that simply just had nothing to do. And they would now stand up against the foreigners and look at the foreigners as if they were the ones that had brought in all the trouble to China. They would gather around the temples, and the foreigners would label them the Boxers. That was not what they called themselves. They called themselves Ihotuan, among other names, and that means sort of the glorious righteous movement, because they were here to actually protect the empire against the foreigners that had come in and stirred the order. Now, this was not surprising at all. If you look into documents of China up through the 1800s, this kind of thing happened all the time. And it was not only against the foreigners. You would have uprisings because people were starving or discontent with something. It happened many, many, many times. The surprising thing about this was that you allowed the Boxers access into Beijing. This whole thing started in Shandong province. The governor of Shandong did not like the Boxers. He was, by the way, called Yuan Shikai and would later become the president of China. But he would force them out of Shandong, and reactionary forces in the Chinese government would let them in, pretty much actually invite them into the capital. And as you can imagine, Beijing was defined by a wall. So you don't just walk into Beijing. These people were allowed access into the city of Beijing. And they would now start to walk in the streets, yelling, "Kill, kill, kill," at night. And this was obviously something that surprised the Europeans. But if you look into the writings of Robert Hart, a very important figure at this point, he was in charge of the customs service in China. Then at first, the foreign nations were actually not really working together, because everybody wanted to see, what can we get out of this? How can we position ourselves as the mediator and get some kind of special privilege out of this when it comes to commerce with China? So at this point, you could say that a lot of the Western nations were actually not really allied. They had their own national interests. But then happened something that would spiral this into an enormous crisis. And that was that when the ambassador, at that point you would call him minister, Clemens von Ketteler of Germany, he sat in his sedan chair and was carried towards the foreign ministry in the capital. Then something happened, and that was that he did not get very far. Then he was stopped, and an officer in the Imperial Army leveled his rifle at the window in the sedan chair and shot Clemens von Ketteler dead. Now you had an enormous crisis on hand, because this was the representative of a superpower, Germany, that had been killed. And not enough with that, actually the Chinese government would start to almost like declare war on the foreign nations inside of the legation quarter. Something that you had not anticipated, obviously because it felt like suicide that the Chinese government should want to take on the whole world at the same time. But this was the tipping point. Clemens von Ketteler was dead, and it was as if now there was no turning back. This had to become a sort of gigantic crisis on an international scale. Next. Here you have a cover of Le Petit Journal, French magazine, and this is actually not our own magazine, but we have collected a lot of other magazines from this period, and we have hundreds and hundreds of pages from this time. And that is why I was, without any doubt, can tell you that the year 1900, in the year 1900, then the Boxer Rebellion was breaking news all over the world. Next. And then you have an international scope. Obviously, you need to have that to have a real sort of international crisis. Next. And what you're looking at now is what the legation quarter of Beijing looked like before the year 1900, where everything would change. If you live in Beijing, then you probably know that to the left of in the map, then you have what is today the Tiananmen Square. It is like this sort of T-shaped thing. That is pretty much where you have the Tiananmen Square today. And just next to it, you installed the foreigners after they had forced themselves upon China around 1860. And the Chinese did not really want them in the capital, but they had no choice. And a very interesting thing is that when this legation quarter here came into existence, then the meeting that was sort of where you signed the protocol and so on was not made inside the Forbidden City. I assume that a lot of you guys that are listening have been or know of the enormous palace of Beijing. And when you get into the palace and you go through the courtyards and see all of the halls, then a good way of understanding the palace is that all of these halls actually had a some kind of purpose that related to a certain use. But because this legation quarter was not something you really wanted, then down south, where you had the least prestigious sort of places in Beijing, you would find a temple. And the Chinese government would actually pretty much take over this temple. And then you would sort of sign the treaty here, because the legations had been forced upon China. It was something that actually penetrated directly into the Chinese system. And at the same time, around 1860, you also forced a foreign ministry upon China. And around that T-shape that I pointed out to you before, you had the original ministries that served the palace. This was not where you would put the foreign ministry. You would place that one northeast of an area called Dongdan. And you did that pretty much on purpose, because once again, it was actually intimidating for the Chinese bureaucracy to have the foreigners this close by. Also notice, when you look at the legation quarter here, that inside the map, you can sort of make out a place that says Hanling, and one that says like the Imperial Carriage Park, the Mongol Market, and the Su Wangfu. Those were all Chinese institutions. And that shows you that at this point, this was not a foreign island. This whole area was not under international law, and you could not trade from here. You only had these diplomatic residences. It was only in the treaty ports like Tianjin, Shanghai, Hong Kong, and so on, that you could actually trade, and you had these enormous international areas. But in Beijing, you did not have a whole lot of foreigners, because they were actually not allowed to be too many here, and you had very, very few soldiers. So when the Boxer Rebellion happened, and these 55 days started of this enormous crisis after Clemens von Ketteler had been killed on the 20th of June, then inside this compound you can see here, you had 500 civilians just about, and you had the same number pretty much of soldiers. And these soldiers had been called in from around Tianjin when this thing started to escalate out of hand. Also notice that you have a red line in the map. That is the defense line and how it changed over these 55 days. One of the reasons that we have so many maps from the Boxer Rebellion in our collection is that this was seen as the breaking news of the world, as sort of the yellow man standing up against the white man. So as you can imagine, you had so much sort of souvenir paraphernalia produced around this incident. Next. And that leads me to it being the breaking news of the world. Next. I just told you that this was seen as actually the white man standing up against the yellow man. And when you look into the magazines of the time, then it is amazing in how many ways the people inside the legation quarter, they are dying. It is described how they would stand up against the yellow man, and how you would have thousands of Chinese come, and finally you would have, you know, women and men shot by the men, because that was the most civilized thing to do, the most merciful thing to do, because when the Chinese got to them, there was no imagining what would not happen. Obviously, the only problem was that most of them inside the legation quarter were still very much alive. But this was breaking news, and it could sell newspapers. So in lack of information, you would pretty much just make up things. And they all pretty much played in to this almost nationalist or racist way of looking at this incident. Next. And a good example of that is also the picture you can see here from a magazine called Black and White. And you have probably heard about the Dowager Cixi, but I'm sure that it is difficult for you to recognize her in this picture, but it's actually meant to be her. And a good example of what I just said is what is like the text that follows the picture here. And it says, "Those who know this mysterious and shifty-eyed woman know that the foreigners in China have no bitterer enemy." And I think it's fair to say that the Boxer Rebellion is really participating in creating this idea of being personified evil in the world. I should maybe also remember to say that if you want to look at some of these pictures, then if you go into Facebook and just write Beijing Postcards and find our site, we will have them on the Facebook page as well if you want to scrutinize them. Okay, next. And then that leads me to another thing that is often like present when you are talking about a crisis, and that is the rampant rumor mongering. And next, if we talk about the British, if we talk about the foreign community, then it was obviously a huge rumor in itself that you had killed all of the Europeans. And here you can see how in very great detail you show the whole British legation, and the very gate into it is actually the only thing that looks exactly the same before and after the year 1900 and up till today. And you can see how it says that the Europeans made their last stand in here. They did not, they were still very much alive. But if we return to Clemens von Ketteler, the guy whose death actually sort of started all of this, then it's also interesting that he was actually reported dead just a couple of days before he actually died. And why was this? There has been a lot of speculation about that. And why would he be in the Chinese newspapers reported as dead this early? And a lot of people think that it was because he was not exactly an angel himself. He would, when the Boxers came in, be one of the people that really made the whole situation escalate. From top of the wall, he would, together with other people inside the legation quarter, shoot at the Boxers, and in this way enrage them. So it was speculated that when he was actually killed, then you had targeted him on purpose because he was not exactly innocent. And when we talk about the rumor mongering, it is also important not to forget the Chinese side, obviously. You had, after the Opium Wars, suddenly a huge amount of foreigners settling in China. And many times you had all kinds of rumors that would emerge. Many of these rumors had to do with the missionaries, because the missionaries, they were very different from from sort of the diplomacy. They would penetrate into the countryside. A lot of them actually had pretty good Chinese, and they would try to very actively change Chinese society. So very often they would get up against a strong sort of opposition. And that meant in the local communities, and they would often create trouble. And so it's not at all a coincidence that the first Westerner that was killed in and sort of sparked the Boxer Rebellion becoming a crisis was in 1899. You had a foreign missionary that was killed. At that point, you did not look upon this as a huge crisis. It did not, but it did become that when Clemens von Ketteler, he was killed. And on the Chinese side, the reason for targeting the missionaries was because you were afraid that the missionaries were taking out the eyes of orphans and making, you know, black magic out of it. You had all kinds of very weird sort of rumors around the foreigners, as you can imagine. Next. Then you have one that I think is also almost, that we are almost able to compare with the Corona crisis one-to-one. We have wavering, I could have written incompetent governments, and a lot of miscommunication. And here I would like to talk about another German next. And it is the Kaiser Wilhelm. Because at this point, you actually in Germany had a government that was sort of in conflict with itself, you could say, because the Kaiser, he actually wanted to sort of show the world. He wanted to show that now a new superpower had come into place, but he had a problem, and that was that a lot of the good spots in the world, they had been taken by other powers, because for a long time Bismarck did not want colonies. And the reason Bismarck did not want colonies was that he did simply not find them feasible. He simply did not think that you could earn money on the colonies. They would only bring you trouble. The trade was what brought you money, but trying to control another country with a very different culture, that could only bring trouble. But obviously having a lot of colonies, presiding over an empire, also gave you national pride. And that was in many ways what the Kaiser, he was after. And standing on Bremerhaven, the Kaiser would send German soldiers to China to deal with this. The interesting thing here is that when these 55 days, they finally ended, then it was actually not the Germans that would charge in and stop this, because they didn't get to Beijing in time. The German soldiers, they had to go all the way from Europe, whereas the other powers were much closer. So when the Germans arrived, pretty much all of the fighting had been done. Nevertheless, but just for getting you into the sort of the atmosphere, then Kaiser Wilhelm, standing on Bremerhaven, would say this to the German soldiers. He said, "You have the task before you of revenging a hideous crime, that of the violation of the sanctity of ambassadors and the laws of hospitality. You are going to meet an enemy which it is right that you should know never gives quarter and never takes prisoners. I exhort you so to comport yourself as German soldiers, that for 1,000 years no Chinaman shall dare to look with an evil eye upon a German. You will open the way for civilization for all time. Adieu, comrades." The reason that this exposed a wavering government is that the civilian government, they were shocked because they did not want the Kaiser to sort of behave like this. So they tried to arrest all of the journalists that had been present when the Kaiser, he made this speech. But one was apparently close enough to a window and got through it and got this story out into the press. So here we have a government that where one part of it actually wants to charge in and another one wants to do something much more moderate. When we look at the Chinese government, it was actually the same. We should not forget that only 2 years before the year 1900, you had actually tried to reform China from the inside. Very famous Chinese intellectuals like Kang Youwei and Liang Qichao, they had tried to reform the Chinese government, but they did not succeed. They were ousted and they fled. And after they had fled, then some of the most reactionary forces in the Chinese government had taken over, but they did not have all of the power. And actually, all the way through the first, like the beginning of the year 1900, the Chinese government would be wavering. Sometimes they would actually fight the Boxers, kill them in the hundreds, sometimes in the thousands. But finally, you would sort of make up your mind and support the Boxers. And after Clemens von Ketteler had died, there was no turning back. But it is interesting that today, if you look at a general like one called Nie Shicheng, that is seen as a national hero, then he was actually just a couple of sort of a couple of weeks before he became a martyr. Then he had killed a lot of Boxers, but today you can find a statue of him standing up against the foreign threat. So you have a lot of governments that are wavering, that do not have a clear sort of idea about what they think about the Boxer Rebellion, who they should support. And this is also one of the reasons that the crisis would escalate into what it finally became next. And that brings me to the nationalism and the racism, because it seems as if when you are pressed the most, this is what you will always sort of find in the toolbox. There is nothing like nationalism and racism to rein in people. Next. And I assume that the most of you guys have heard about the expression, the Yellow Peril. The Yellow Peril was actually an expression that I don't think he invented it himself, Kaiser Wilhelm, but he would promote it so much all over the world that this expression would pretty much become his. And the Yellow Peril was something you would hear repeated in the Western press again and again. This idea that the Chinese, they were coming. And the Kaiser felt that because it was Clemens von Ketteler that had been killed, then Germany, they had a sort of a higher or larger, bigger right for vengeance, you could say. And this was also something that he could use politically. Next. So when all of this was over, when these 55 days, they were over and the diplomatic personnel had been saved, then the Germans, they would argue, we want something in Beijing because we have a special right for vengeance. And finally, what they got was the archway that you can see here. And I don't know if it's how clear it is, but I think you can make up that if you see sort of the middle gate and go up, then I think you can see that there is sort of something written in Chinese. This is actually an apology written by the emperor himself to the German nation. And this archway stood originally where Clemens von Ketteler, he had been killed. But then something happened. And that was that the Germans, they lost the First World War. And in the midst of the World War, then the Chinese government would change sides. They would no longer be neutral, actually tilting towards supporting the Germans. They would now go against Germany. So you moved this archway into what is today the Zhongshan Park, and where you can find it. And when you moved it, the apology from the emperor was also taken down. And this archway became a symbol of the atrocities committed against the Chinese people during the Boxer Rebellion. Next. And as a good example of how that plays out today, then you can see a poster here, and that is a poster of a theater play that is played every year here in the capital. It's not super popular because it is a very government sort of piece, and it's actually quite dull, to be honest. Me and my wife went to see it, but it's simply just called Paifang, and you know, that just means archway in Chinese. But it is about, next, this master builder who refuses to build this archway for the foreign devils. He simply does not want to do it. But the horrible feudal government that only wants to sort of do something that is good for them, they force him to do it. And the whole play is ending with him screaming when he is sort of, because he's so ashamed that he has made this symbol of feudalism in the center of the capital. Next. And then there's another thing that I think is very easy for us to forget, and that is coincidence. There is, you know, in a crisis, almost always coincidences that makes this into a real crisis. And if it had not been for these coincidences, it would have played out in a whole other way, or maybe not happened at all. Next. And one thing I think is very interesting to talk about here is the Boxers themselves, because a lot of them, I'm saying that the Boxers were peasants. That's not completely true. You did also have actually fairly high up people that joined the ranks of the Boxers, but a lot of them, they were very humble people, and they were, you know, you had peasants among them. You also had people that used to drag boats alongside, along the Grand Canal. And these people, one of the reasons that they started to march towards the capital was that they had nothing else to do. It was in the midst of a huge drought that lasted more than 100 days. Some of the anger turned towards the foreigners came from hunger, but some of it also came just because you had nothing else to do. And then you reacted against the foreigners. And a book I would like you to also know about is Paul Cohen's book that is called 3 Keys in History, about the Boxer Rebellion. And this book is a much more comprehensive book than Diana Preston's book. It's actually in some way a better history book. Diana Preston's book is, you could say, extremely entertaining. But if you want a really good history book, then Paul Cohen's book is maybe where you want to go. And he describes how you would have these gatherings around Boxer altars where they would do their magic, and you would have thousands and thousands of Boxers. But then it started to rain, and then they would go home and attend to their fields. So the thing is, if this drought had not happened, then the Boxers would not have started their march towards Beijing. And obviously the weather having such an impact is in so many ways a coincidence. And much of the sort of miscommunication and sheer incompetence that happens also is very much on the coincidence side. There's so much that plays in and finally makes this into an international crisis of enormous proportions. In fact, the whole thing is so messy that even today, I find it very difficult to answer the question, what really was the Boxer Rebellion? Because it just seems to be all of these factors that finally, as a snowball, became an avalanche and then created this crisis situation that would have an immense impact on the world. Next. And then there is religion. This is pretty much the only place in these 10 points that I have found where I think we cannot make a one-to-one comparison with the coronavirus. Because admittedly, religion has not played a huge role in the coronavirus. It has not played a huge role in the coronavirus.
Yes, leave it. I can even listen.
Okay. We only have obviously a sect in South Korea that would obviously have what you could say that kept on going to Wuhan, and a lot of them they would get this disease. But religion is not really playing a role in this crisis. But when it comes to the Boxer Rebellion, then religion is an enormous topic. Next one. Here you can see from a magazine how a temple is getting burned down. Because the temples, that was where you had all of these people gather. They would gather at the temples, like the Boxers. That's what I'm talking about when I say the people. Because the temples, that would be where people would logically gather. This was where you had all of the practices of Qigong and Kung Fu that made the foreigners label them as the Boxers. And when we talk about religion, you should imagine that actually to the Boxers, this was a war that was not only fought with weapons in hand, this was also a war of ideas. The foreigners had brought into China a whole new idea about what it meant to be a woman. They were against the bound feet. They allowed women to study and to work outside the home. And these practices were among the reasons that you had all of these frictions in the countryside of Shandong that would create this whole crisis situation. And when it all ended, after these 55 days where the legation quarter was under siege, then another thing happens that is interesting. And that is, to a lot of Chinese people, they feel that the one Western God has actually defeated the many Chinese gods. So after this, after the year 1900, this is one of the reasons that this is so impactful to a lot of Chinese people. There is no turning back. A lot of these Western ideas have proved themselves stronger simply because they have been enforced with such power in China. Next. And then obviously there is the aftermath. And that is obviously also interesting when we talk about the coronavirus, because what is going to happen after the crisis that we are in the midst of? And I think it's interesting to look at some of the things that happened after the Boxer Rebellion, because it's very diverse. It affected a whole lot of things that I think is very difficult actually to imagine. Next. And here you can see how it ended. And I would also like you to notice the illustrated London news on top, because a lot of the images I've showed you, they come from the illustrated London news. And when I say this was the breaking news all over the world, then you should imagine that this magazine here was one of the most important magazines within the British Empire. And you can see that this is from December, a couple of months after the legation quarter was actually relieved. But they're still writing about it. And they would pretty much in every magazine write a whole lot about it. When what you can see is that through the Watergate, some British soldiers, Indian soldiers on the British flag, they are making themselves into the legation quarter and relieving the legation quarter. Next. And just so that you know what kind of a city Beijing was, then I couldn't help show this one. When I flipped through the different pages, then this one is just mind-blowing to me. This is the main street of the legation quarter, and to me it just looks like something from the Wild West. So when we're talking about the aftermath and how this impacted Beijing, then you should imagine that pretty much all of the streets, they were actually dirt streets in Beijing. Next. And here you have a little sort of some bullet points about how it affected Beijing. The first train station would be built inside of the walls. You had been very much against the train because it was a foreign thing and because you were afraid of losing power. But the foreigners would argue very strongly that if Boxerism happened again, then you wanted to be able to flee. And then because all of the money you had to pay to the nations that had been involved pretty much made China bankrupt. At least it was something that affected the city of Beijing to legalize prostitution so that you could tax the brothels. Then you had the Beijing police force. When all of this ended, you would have 8 allied nations come in and occupy Beijing. So in a Berlin-like way, you would divide the city and have different zones. And the French and the Japanese, they would together with Prince Xu actually start to create a modern police force. And this police force has a direct relation, you could say, to the police force that is in place today. The Americans had a problem because, you know, they were land of the free. How could they participate in something like this, like, you know, occupying China and obviously almost colonizing it? So they actually diverted some of the money that had been given to them through these Boxer indemnities to other purposes. And among other things, the Tsinghua University actually started as a consequence of this. Other things were that you would have a huge foreign presence in Beijing, and you would now get a lot of knowledge of Beijing in the world because you could now go pretty much where you wanted to in the capital. Next. And you could discuss, did the Boxer Rebellion actually ultimately cause the fall of the Qing? It's a stretch. We cannot say that completely, but when I sit at the archives and look into the legation files of, for instance, the British legation, then they will say that don't bother with the Chinese government. That is not where the power is. The power is in the provinces. Talk to them. After the Boxer Rebellion, the government pretty much never was able to sort of have a decent comeback, get on top of things. In 1912, the boy Emperor Puyi abdicated from power. Next. And what was the legacy of this whole thing? Next. Here you have 55 Days in Beijing. It's like a movie that was made with Charlton Heston. So on the foreign side, you would tap into this very strong nationalism about the Chinese standing up against the foreigners. And on the Chinese side, I think it's fair to say that the legacy in China has become a very one-sided way of talking about the 8 allied nations. And they were indeed not very allied indeed. But today, the Boxer Rebellion on the Chinese side is very much used in propaganda, and it's not far since that it's not long since that you have actually started to hear it referred to as well at, for instance, the 2 big meetings, where the parliament is gathering in China. So it's still very much there, and the narrative of the Boxer Rebellion is still getting shaped. Next. And in the end, I would just like to make a little promotion, because my company makes walks in the Legation Quarter. So if you want to hear more about the Legation Quarter and the Boxer Rebellion, then we have at least one Boxer walk a month here in the